We've got the template design loading in like we want it to. The next step is to make the app functional. But the question is, where do we start? There are so many areas to cover. I always prefer to start with the user system. Most applications, regardless of their use, rely on a user system to work. You can't upload a song unless you know who's uploading it. It depends on the needs of your app. For this example, I think it would be a good starting point. In order to have users, we need to be able to store and manage users. We'll need to have a way to authenticate or register them. Authentication and registration is a good starting point. We'll begin with the user system. Before we begin coding the logic, we first need to understand something called state. The word state is a word that's thrown around a lot in the world of JavaScript. But what exactly does it mean? State refers to the data in the application. This can be data retrieved from a database or API, data like a blog post, product, or media content. You can use the state to store application data too. There are certain types of data you wouldn't normally store in a database. However, they're still necessary for your app to function correctly. For example, a simple dropdown. If a user clicks on a dropdown button, then the contents of that dropdown should be shown. If they click away from that dropdown, then the content should be hidden. This is the type of data you would have to keep track of. Another example would be keeping track of the page the user is currently on. Are they on the home page or contact page? Depending on the URL, you would display different content. Vue provides one way of storing data by adding the data function to a component. While not wrong, it's considered good practice to have one single source of truth. All of this is considered the state of the application. When you hear the word state, it's another way of saying data. It's data that is carefully kept track of while the application is live on a user's browser. If the user is on the home page, then you can call this the home state. If they're logging in, then you can call this the authentication state. It's used to describe what is currently happening in the application. So don't think of state as the data from the database. It's also the data that keeps track of the little things. Throughout this course, we've been using the data property as a way to keep track of things. The data property can be considered a way to store local state. It's data that only one component needs. However, what if we need to share data across multiple components? We need a way to have global state. Global state is when data is shared across multiple components. We have the option of passing down data to other components using props. To send data back to the parent component, you could use a callback function or emit an event. In this example, let's say I had data that was used in child components B and C. Child component C is capable of updating the data. To perform updates on data, we first have to pass down a callback function to child component A and then to C. Child component C can use the callback function to update the data inside the parent component. Lastly, the updated data would be sent to component B. This is the usual flow of data. It's what we've been doing up until now. For a small to a medium-sized application, this works fine. It's a bit annoying to have to pass down everything, but it's certainly doable and manageable. For larger applications, this process of managing global state can become quite tedious very quickly. Imagine if you had 10 layers of components in your application. That means you would have to pass down a callback function 10 times. That isn't very fun. Luckily, Vue allows you to create your own library to manage state on a global level. We won't be going down that route. It's not necessary to do so. Instead, there are already libraries out there that will do this for us. The most popular solution is called Pinia. Pinia is a library for storing data in a central location. You won't have to pass it down from component to component. The state is directly accessible to all components. It doesn't matter how deeply nested your components are. The data can be retrieved or updated. Any changes to the data are reflected in all components. This means it's no longer necessary to pass down data through several children components. Data is handled in one centralized location. Pinia is maintained by the core developers of Vue. You don't have to worry about compatibility issues. This is the library we'll be using for the rest of this course. There's one important point I want to stress. Centralized state is completely optional even if you have it installed. Sometimes you'll have data that will be used in a single component. If you don't plan on passing it down onto other components, you don't need to store it inside the centralized state. Components can still have their own set of data. That's important to understand. You don't want to clutter your state.